My name is Dr. Graham Pruss. I am one of the co-founders and organizers of the National Vehicle Residency Collective. I'm an anthropologist who has been working with people who live in vehicles for the past decade, starting originally in Seattle with people who live on city streets, but expanding to people who live in open areas, Bureau of Land Management areas, national forests, and other publicly accessible spaces.
Fantastic. So just for full context, the archetype person that's listening to this right now, and we can absolutely dive into the Seattle car camping, all that. But a lot of people listening to this right now are going to be your camper van, RVers, school bus dwellers, or people more likely, in my honest opinion, are people that are curious about the lifestyle. And
Right.
a lot of the questions, a lot of the inquiries, and people that actually haven't been on the road is how do you find places to park? Is it safe? Yeah, what are the legalities? Like does it count as my domicile? Everybody knows. Well, if you ever watch Breaking Bad, when one of the main characters is almost going to get
Right.
busted, he's like, "Hey, this RV is my domicile. What are you doing? You can't harass me." Like
Right.
what? Not that we have Breaking Bad people out there that are listening to this, but it's like there's so much shrouded in what you see on TV, what you think it actually is versus the reality because you're like more boots on the ground. So my first
Yeah.
question to you is like what is the overarching view that society has versus what you see day to day? Like what is the reality of the differences?
That's a great question. And actually, it's really kind of become the focus of my research over the past decade is that the way that society tends to view vehicle residency, which is sort of the way the term that we use on the whole, so general, just living in a vehicle as your full-time residence, is sort of in two sort of extremes that are very different. One side of it is either as temporary vacationing that is often indicates affluence and maybe someone who's not working or generally just traveling. The other side, which is very opposite, is abject homelessness. Right? It's extreme poverty. It's seen as like the van down by the river and all the stereotypes that we know that go along with that.
The
And
last
what I've
resort.
seen, and I'm sure you have experienced and may resonate with many of your listeners, is that what's missing in between that is the vehicle as affordable housing. And that so many people are using their vehicles as long term housing as a way to meet their personal needs, either while they're working remotely or to have a better connection with their natural world, while they're engaged in outdoor activities or remote or seasonal work as they travel across the country. And so that's really where a lot of my work and a lot of the work that we do with the National Vehicle Residency Collective focuses on is how to advocate for and protect the civil rights and property rights of people who live in their vehicles as house.
So simply put, what is the baseline when somebody is living, let's just use a Honda Element. Somebody is living out of their Honda Element, and we'll start there and move our way up. What are the actual legal realities of that person living in their Honda Element?
Well, it generally depends upon the municipality and at the state level in some places. In most point places in the United States, it's not illegal to live in your vehicle, whether that's a Honda Element or an RV or school bus. So, in general, it is not illegal. Now, that definitely is not all over the place. In fact, some states recently, such as Tennessee, have passed laws that make it actually illegal, even a felony, to sleep outdoors. And that may mean in your vehicle in a public space that would be considered outdoors. So whether that's a Honda Element or any larger size vehicle, it would apply. In places like San Diego, it's the same thing. Actually, if you're sleeping in your vehicle in any type, that could be legally problematic, and you could actually, even in San Diego, you could actually be taken into custody under their vehicle habitation ordinance. Again, regardless of vehicle size. So this is where there's a lot of overlap there. Now the difference is, of course, of living in a Honda Element versus a school bus or a box truck. The size is really a lot of that, right? So that could be a good, could be there's benefits and sort of detractors for that, right? Or challenges that come from that, as I'm sure you know, right? That the size can obviously make for a more comfortable living experience indoors. You have more space for your property, more place to store things, more place to do work. But of course, the challenge is that for people who are living in cities, that they can't, they can't work on the vehicle outside of it. It can be easier because it's easier to park the vehicle because it's smaller, of course. And there are less legal restrictions typically on smaller vehicles. In most cities in the United States, vehicles that are considered oversized, which would be 80 inches wide or over like 10 feet long, it sort of depends upon the municipality what they define as oversized. But a van, a large truck, a school bus, an RV, all of these would be counted as oversized. Many cities require oversized vehicles to park in industrial zones overnight. And so that would be a significant difference, right? If you're living in a Honda Element, you wouldn't be required necessarily to park in that industrial zone overnight.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit. I want to unpack why Tennessee and San Diego have decided to criminalize this, and what is the reasoning? What's the actual boots on the ground from what you're seeing, probably going to the city council meetings, talking to residents, like really studying it? Why are they doing it? What is the angels on the angel and the devil on the shoulder? Let's still man both sides, right? Let's not, just be like they're right, they're wrong. Let's hear both arguments for those, and we'll just use those two as examples. I feel like that's a good starting point because we have middle of the country, heartland, then you have the beach vibes, right? You have both. So let's start with Tennessee. What is
Yeah.
the pro or the good angel, bad devil? What's going on there?
It's a great way to put it, actually. And thinking about it in that kind of sense, it's that binary, right? What's the good and the evil? When often there's a lot of in between, right? But that's a great. Let's look at it through that frame because I think that it's similar for both San Diego and Tennessee. What we'll see. So that the good angel, right, is that people who are living in an RV or a school bus theoretically have enough money to afford a campground, to be able to afford a private parking space. So the idea being that if you are sleeping in public space, you're doing so against sort of the general society good, and that if you can afford to be in your vehicle because it is seen as this affluent vacationing, then you should be parked in a private space like a campground or an RV park or something like that. So the rule that says you cannot be in public space would be to enforce that. Now, on the other side, the negative side is that they're saying, okay, but if you can't afford to be in that, well, then that would be homelessness, right? And if you're theoretically, again, this is the bad angel, right? The devil on the shoulder would be saying that this person is poor and is unable to afford a private place to be, so that they should not be in public space. And then that law is then to actually make it illegal for them to be in public space.
Oh,
This is again
okay.
where, like I was talking about before, that sort of binary between seeing it as either affluence or poverty misses what's in between, which is it as housing. And so for the many people who are living in that vehicle as housing, they're still kicked out of Tennessee and can't park in the public space, even if it is, in between. They can't, they don't want to pay for the camp spot, right? But at the same time, they're not, it is their form of housing that they prefer.
Yeah. So that makes complete sense because I think it is important to define that what we are speaking about a lot in this conversation, because the line gets blurred because we will obviously get into BLM public land, public space there versus public space in a city. And what we are talking about right now is public space. Like obviously in Tennessee, they're not going to make it illegal to go to an RV park and camp. This is, you know,
Right.
parking your vehicle at the local Walmart or, the pull over on the side of the gas station and put some towels up, like, like the whole spectrum, right? So we're talking
Actually,
about public camping, right?
very specifically, yeah, very specifically, it's about parking in either public parking. It might be a public space. Might also be a rest stop, or pulled over in a park, something like that. A Walmart or a gas station, actually, that is private space, and so those places can already be enforced, right? The private property owner can already say, "Hey, call a company and have people tow." Right? This is actually that the state of Tennessee has made it so that they have a law that is moving through their systems that will make it so that you actually, I'm sorry, no, it went through and began enforcement this year that makes it so that it's a felony to sleep outdoors in public spaces.
Gotcha. Understood. That makes sense. Thanks for clarifying. So California, good devil or good angel, bad devil. What are the arguments there?
And this is where it's very much the same, right? So San Diego is a perfect example of this. It's that it's on both sides, right? It's that people who are property owners who have very valuable, beautiful views of the ocean complain about RVs that are parked in front of their properties, obstructing their views. People who visit the beaches, and live in these areas or have businesses in these areas complain about impromptu, KOAs basically on their public streets. And again, it's the way that it's seen is either these are vacationers who can afford to be in a private space and then they should be there, or this is homelessness and people don't want to see that homelessness on their streets, so it's being removed from that street. And again, this is where the response of it's actually for many people this is just housing, right? And they may be moving that housing all over the country. They may be actually just displaced from the community of San Diego, relying upon that vehicle as their primary housing to continue working, to continue keeping their kids in a local school. But in either sense, missing that it's housing, they're not creating the space for that vehicle as housing. Instead, there's a punitive response, which is just to say, really get out, right? Or actually, literally in San Diego, you can actually be taken into custody for evidence of sleeping in your vehicle.
Yeah, so it's more of just making it enforceable to where they can quote get rid of the problem. So I'm gonna follow that up with a question. Have you been to Tennessee and experienced people that have dealt with this law, or is that more of a San Diego thing for you personally?
So I have not been to Tennessee since this law. I haven't been there since I was a child, to be honest. So I haven't been to Tennessee in quite some time. But as the organizer, or one of the organizers for the National Vehicle Residency Collective, we have many attendees, members. Actually, many of our members are members also of the Home on Wheels Alliance. So we have a lot of overlap in people who travel through Tennessee and have brought this up as something that they have seen and are very concerned about as they move through that state. Now
So
for
the
San Diego, yes, I have seen that on the ground there, and actually, am one of the expert witnesses on a class action suit against the city of San Diego around the vehicle habitation ordinance and the oversized vehicle ordinance.
Okay, so real quick with the Tennessee example, the people part of the organizations that you're a part of, do they have any stories like firsthand experience, like somebody that has experienced this and how it went through the legal system? If not, no pressure on that because I don't know how much you can disclose about the San Diego side of things, or if it's not actually an active case or just a story, because I just want the audience to have a little bit more because right now we're talking in theoreticals, right? I'm very curious how this actually translates to real people. And I guess it doesn't have to be Tennessee or San Diego. It could be another example. But do you have any examples of how this actually plays out?
Absolutely. Focuses it a bit. Yes, absolutely. So first off, the Tennessee ordinance is relatively new, right? If my recollection is correct, it began enforcement in this January. So it's only 4 months in. I haven't seen any cases yet of vehicle residents who have been actually received a felony. But this is a concern. So I personally have not heard any on the ground reports of people being ticketed for this yet, but it's kind of wait and see. And of course, we don't want to see that happen, to be honest. Now, the San Diego case, I interviewed people in San Diego, spent time in San Diego. I have my vehicle is built out, so I sleep in my vehicle when I do my research, and I also slept on the streets of San Diego to sort of see sort of what people were experiencing there as well, very briefly. And one of the things, the there are, for anyone who has been to San Diego, this will come as no surprise. There are signs throughout the city that are very explicitly targeting vehicle residency, that very much say vehicles that are used for habitation are not allowed. And whether or not people receive, there's been actually a moratorium on this law. These two ordinances went in about 7 years ago, if I remember right. This is a long case that's been going. And there was a moratorium on, or a pausing of the enforcement of the law during the course of this case. So they stopped actually enforcing it, but they continued to put up signs that said that this law was enforced, right? So the threat of the law, the fact that these signs are around that says if you sleep in your vehicle, you can be arrested and taken into custody, is enough to cause many people to not actually see that they can park in a space. So that right there constrains their livable space. And then, of course, there's people who actually have been ticketed, have had all of their possessions taken during an impound. People who have been, the biggest fear is that a person is, and I think it actually did happen to one person. I can't speak too much on the specifics of the case, but that it has, I believe, a person has been taken into custody. Their vehicle was impounded, which meant that they essentially lost all of their goods, all of their possessions, because of simply sleeping in their vehicle. And that is, I think, a fear that many people who live in their vehicles would justifiably have. Right, we would not want that to happen. Now, what I have seen, I worked in Seattle for a decade. As an outreach worker for 2 years to about 1,500 people living in vehicles. And I worked to advise people about upcoming law enforcement, about ticketing, about impounds, to help people, to warn people and help them to avoid these things. I saw it happen many, many times over. And the real effect of this is that people have their homes impounded. When especially a large vehicle is impounded, it often, the tow truck destroys the vehicle because it drags on the back when it gets towed in. It's extremely expensive to tow the vehicle. The vehicle is then impounded and held in storage at a very expensive rate. It's if you've ever had your vehicle impounded, the storage on them is actually jacked up really high. And what happens is that within a couple days, the fees on that are so extreme that the person can't even get the vehicle out of impound, and they essentially lose everything. We did a study in Seattle where we actually pulled the tickets that were issued to people living in vehicles. We did a Freedom of Information Act request and looked at 2 years of tickets that were issued, and published an article in the Department of Housing and Urban Development showing this research, and showed about how first off how rarely they were actually paid back, right? To show that the cost on the taxpayers was extreme, right? That there was the policing cost, and yet there was very little actually recompensation for that actual ticket. And then also what it actually did to the person who lived in the vehicle. We showed one individual, a man who had his RV ticketed 15 times, I think it was, in 1 year, and was basically forced to move from area to area throughout Seattle until eventually his vehicle was impounded and then sold at auction to another person for $10. And this is, is a very revolving door practice that's common in a lot of communities. So this is sort of like, that's sort of the worst case scenario. In fact, and it could even be much worse than that. I think the worst case scenario is the person's actually arrested, serves time, actually gets a criminal record, and loses all their possessions. And that's what's happening. That's what we're trying to fight.
So I guess if we're playing it even here, like I'm curious because I know people within the audience, or where my head goes, if somebody's getting a ticket 15 times, like, and of course he's probably stuck in a situation where I don't know if it's work, I don't know what it is, but why do people stick around cities that are hostile towards them? Because I guess it's probably entitled for me to say, I'm just thinking like going out to public land, but I guess they don't have the opportunity to have this magic little box called a laptop and work and money and all that, or resources. Like, why? It sounds like there's a push away, but people are holding on. Why is that?
Oh, that great question. It's this is that's what I've learned from people living in vehicles, and particularly from working with people in the cities, and then working with people who are more remote and are more rural areas, and coming to gatherings like Schoolie Palooza, the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous, and meeting people who are full time on the road. Is that people who are living in cities tend to be, from an anthropological perspective, we in looking at nomadism, which has been studied for a long time, we would call this they're geographically tethered. They're connected to a physical community. they tend to be displaced from that community. They often were lost housing and moved into a vehicle as a way to maintain a connection to that community. They might be relying on medical services, mental health services, veteran services in that community. Often their family and friends are there. Their children might be going to school there. For all these reasons, and of course they may work there, of course, in many cases. That for all these reasons, people are tethered to this community and don't leave it. We did a study in Oakland a couple years ago with people living in RVs on public streets, and all across Oakland, we interviewed people, right outside the Home Depot, right, and there, and in various, not just the Home Depot, but these sorts of areas that I'm sure we're familiar with if we've driven by Home Depots in large cities, and 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 asked why people were there, and then what we saw was that they tended to be displaced from that city or the county. They tended to have incomes that were too low to afford local housing, but were too high to receive housing assistance or social services if they even wanted them. And they tended to see themselves as really not having another option, that like they needed to, as far as they saw it, they needed to be in this food and work and everything. And they didn't even know about the option of places like Bureau of Land Management areas. They don't even know that long-term visitor areas existed. Like these sorts of concepts just aren't even like in their perception of reality, because it's just not anything they've ever heard of. And so this is actually one of the things that really inspired me in this work when I met people out in the deserts of why aren't we cross-pollinating this, right? That what if people knew about these other forms of space, right? That I think that for so many people who are living in the cities, it's often that they don't know that there's another possibility. When I ended up going to the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous and meeting people who were outdoor, well, even before that, but when I was meeting people in more rural spaces, and meeting people out in the deserts living in Bureau of Land Management areas, many of them had been from the cities until they learned that these spaces existed, and then they came out to the Bureau of Land Management area. So I think that a lot of it's the knowledge and the I think you're right when you say there's a bit of a privilege, right, of being able to afford gas, afford the travel, of have a vehicle that can make it to Arizona from San Diego, right? And I think that's part of the challenge too, is that for people who are displaced into their vehicles because of eviction or gentrification, generally poverty in general, they're often buying a vehicle that's older and it may not be able to make that trip, right? So like this is
Mhm.
why that RV is getting ticketed 15 times in a year, is that the RV is not really able to drive very far, so it's staying in one parking space for more than 72 hours, and that's the ticket it's getting. It's getting a more than 72-hour ticket, and they're very very minor offenses, but clearly they add up and they disproportionately affect people who can't pay those tickets.
So out of the people that you, and I know we're kind of harping on cities here, I guess I'm just really curious because not many people have the hands-on experience with people living in this situation. Um, how many of the people that you encounter are working within the city? Because it sounds like it's not necessarily that they're just hanging out all day, like they're actually developing some sort of income, or at least they're attempting to. What are you seeing in terms of that?
Yeah, though, and that's a great, again, a great question. Uh, it's hard to give a number because there's so little research on this. There's only a few people who've really been doing these interviews, started to collect this information. And questions like, "What is your?" There's an assumption that people who live on the streets don't have jobs, right? And this is one of the things that we found of talking to people in vehicles. Many do have jobs, and they're not even being asked the question, "Do you have work?" Right? So that question really, there's not good data, unfortunately. What I've seen is that um, you know, maybe half up to three-quarters of the people that I'm meeting who are living in vehicles have some form of active income. And I'm not talking about just like subsidized income. Oh, about what we found actually in our study was I think it was 80% of the people that we interviewed actually had income. Now, a lot of that, there's about maybe 20% or so of that population that we interviewed that was subsidized, right? So that would be unemployment or social security, disability, something like that. Again, very low. It's about $700 a month, right? Is what they're receiving. So nowhere near enough to survive, but it's income. But then there were, about half or so of the people that we talked with. who were working as security guards, who were working in gig economies, who were working in fast food, who were working in uh, uh, home care, and all these a lot of low income jobs, and particularly a lot of temporary contract jobs that weren't enough to pay to live in the communities where they worked, but the community where they worked is where they found their employment, right? And so this was part of the problem too, is that they were actually using that vehicle as a way to live near where they worked, particularly in California, right? And because it's just the housing prices are so extreme that the only places they could afford to live were so far from where they could work that this was the only way they could actually make that work.
Hmm. So I guess when it comes down, again, keeping the audience in mind, from a nomad that's living in a school bus, say you met them at Schoolypalooza versus the person that's currently living in San Diego trying to make it work and don't realize what Schoolypalooza is in public land and doesn't know that Ehrenberg's down the road, right? Um, what is the delta between the two? What is the like? Are there any major misconceptions on two parties, or is it they're more similar than they think, or is the delta pretty large? Like, since you've stepped foot into both worlds, because it is just like it's the same thing, but it is absolutely a different side of the coin, 100% different side of the coin. So, what are the misconceptions? What's the delta between the two people?
Yeah. So I think that there are many more similarities when we actually talk to people, and we find if we go to if you go to Schoolypalooza and you ask where people are from, you're going to find a good portion of people who actually do live in San Diego or live in Los Angeles and come out there for that. So I think there's actually a lot more similarity than we might think, and that the differences really is between the spaces that people occupy, and that's really where the conditions are. That the uh, and then that goes into sort of the resources that people have to be able to get to those spaces and continue to be in those spaces. Once for people who are digital nomads or live in van life and are able to move around between BLM areas, national forests, uh, the the low cost of that, and along with being able to work while they're doing it, can obviously make for a very rewarding, very successful and productive lifestyle. And I think that a lot of people who, when we talk about like sort of like the delta, it's figuring that out. It's actually learning it. It's sort of like if I'm sure you've seen Bob Wells videos and him talking about sort of um, educating people about the opportunities of vehicle residency, right? That it's, and I think that that's really where the change comes, is that when people start learning that that you have every right to have pride in your housing, you have every right to respect and be respected for your private property, right? And that that this lifestyle is a very productive thing. It doesn't have to be something that needs to be seen as stigmatized, but in the cities, the problem is that it tends to be seen as stigmatized, right? And so this is, I think that's if really the difference between these, in terms of sort of the perspective, is that many people who are living in the cities are constantly hit with this stigma, this idea that, well, you're homeless. You have to be homeless because you're living on this public street. And the moment that people are getting out into an area like the BLM lands, they're with other people who are able to say, I love your home. Let me see your home. And that whole sort of stigma of homelessness is able to dissipate. And it's because of the respect of that property and how it's sort of seen differently, in the different types of spaces that it's inhabited, whether that's public parking or more open area like BLM areas.
Okay, so let's humanize this again. And again, just pulling this out. I don't know if you have this example. You said you've been to Schoolypalooza RTR. Um, can you give a firsthand experience of someone that was in San Diego or somewhere in California, or let's say Nevada, or it doesn't have to be California. I don't want to pick on California because sometimes it's
They're easy
easy.
to pick on.
That's what I was gonna say. It's easy to pick on California, but um, somebody that was forced into a vehicle that then you talk to them at Schoolypalooza RTR, and just like you explained, they went through that metamorphosis to stigmatize to then being on the road. Do you have an example? And it doesn't have to be rainbows and unicorns. Like, it doesn't have to be this happy Disney story. I'm just curious of like a real life example of how this has come about.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen it so many times. I've heard people and seen them sort of go through this sort of realization that I went through myself. I won't talk about mine. I'll talk about somebody else's. That I recently at the last RTR I was at, there was a woman who was there from actually from San Diego, and she was living in her RV in on the streets of San Diego. She was displaced from her housing into the RV. So she chose to move into the RV, but it was from a limited set of options that included being evicted, right, and not having another place to live. So we might say that she was forced into it. It's kind of a matter of sort of semantics and how she sees it herself. But so she moved into that RV, was living on the streets. She said that the community around her, because they knew her, because she had lived in this area for years before living in the RV, was very supportive. But that the police didn't know that, and the police had been targeting her RV. She'd been getting a lot of tickets. She was afraid about these laws that she had heard about, these vehicle habitation ordinance, the oversized vehicle ordinance, which would affect her RV. Um, and so she was experiencing this stigmatization. She was saying, I'm not homeless, and yet everybody around me keeps calling me homeless and treating me like I'm homeless. I don't want to use the homeless services because that's not me, but like all they want to do is kind of pigeonhole me into that. And then she's at the Rubber Tramp Rendezvous, where I'm talking with this woman. She's an African American woman, and not that it necessarily matters, but to give a little context of who she is, older woman, and she's saying that that out here she's with people who are saying that they respect their homes, and people she's able to invite people into her home, and she's able to call it her home, and that even just that very simple shift of being able to being have pride and respect for her home, it sort of changed everything, right? That had talked about how she felt almost trapped inside of her RV when she was parked in San Diego, because she had to sort of keep everyone else out, and there was this fear and this discrimination, and she never really knew when a ticket was going to come or someone's going to come and harass her or what might happen. But the moment that she was out with a community of people who saw the vehicle actually as valuable, right, and saw it as something that was a form of housing, that a lot of that went away, and that pride and that respect was sort of restored in her, right? That she was able to value what was her home as home.
Yeah, it's consistent state of fight or flight, it
Right,
seems. And
right.
like, if and that is an interesting situation. I mean, I'll put it this way. Um, I've been doing the vehicle thing for a while. I've never signed a lease, and this is just my personal experience. So when it comes down to living in vehicles, that's all that I've really known. I would rent a place for maybe 6 months, but it's always short term. Like, that's the longest that I've ever rented a place, right? Where right now, for those watching the video, I'm currently in a cargo trailer here down in the Keys. Parking is very limited, but we got to set up here. And it got to a point 2 days ago to where it was like questionable if we are going to be able to stay here because it's like not kosher with the authorities, right? To where I immediately in my head is like, screw it. Like, we'll pack up and go right now. And just having that, it wasn't fight or flight, but just that uncomfortable feeling consistently not knowing. For me doing this for like 12, 13 years, I'm like, fine, whatever. Like, I don't want to be anywhere where I'm not welcome. But that's on top of somebody that's been doing it for 13 years. That's a 200-pound male, right? Versus somebody
Right.
that has lived in a certain spot and all of a sudden they have this pressure. You have the stigma on top of the pressure, and that's their only option. Like, again, I feel like
Right.
I absolutely am privileged to be able to hop in a rig, fill it up with gas, and it doesn't bother me. Where not everybody's in that situation. Like, they're obviously constrained from the get, and that's why they're in that situation. And yeah, I mean, it definitely is a completely different setup when you're consistently feeling like it's almost like you're hunted. Like, it's just this uneasy feeling that goes in your stomach. People that have currently been in rigs, that ever been in that spot, know exactly what I'm talking about. People that are just listening to it, you don't know it until you feel it. Like,
Yep.
it's definitely something it's a very odd, uncomfortable feeling.
It is. It is. It's that feeling of othering, right? That you're sort of like feeling unwanted. That it's and you're like, I'm just like anyone else here. I don't understand why you're looking at me this way, right? But it's like this, this and that was what I think is so valuable about the nomadic community was that this woman, when she was able to be there and connect with people in Quartzsite and see that so many other people were living just like her in ways that were very valuable and very productive and very happy, right? They were healthy and they were loving life. She continued to connect with that. She connected deeper, and she wanted, and I don't even know if she went back to San Diego. I think she might have stayed courtside at least for a while longer to because for her it was like she found her group, and I think that that's one of the things that is valuable about that we can cross pollinate, that we can take back from people who have discovered this privilege of being able to be on the road, right? Of what it means and the sort of the new potentials and the value of being able to pick up stakes and move to the next spot, of being able to trust our gut, right? When if you're in the city and she can't because that's the only neighborhood she knows, suddenly she has a new potential in her perception that's able to change the whole world for her. And that's beautiful. That's amazing. I think that's what we can. I think that's the real value of this work.
Yeah, and it's really hard because again, I'm not in that position, so I don't want to overstep. But it is, and again, it is having just the options to do certain things that I need to be mindful of. But I just goes back to that push and pull to some city wanting you out to where in my mind it's just and again I don't know if it's been on the road so long, but it's just like fine, bet, like I'm gonna do whatever it is. But in the same token, another side of my mind goes to, like, for example, my school bus had a drive shaft snap going down the interstate. That was very, very, very expensive. And I work a ton. I work an absolute ton, and that drained my bank account. And that was one instant. And like if that gets towed, goes to the storage yard, starts racking up every day in storage fees, like I do understand the slippery slope that these people are in. So, when it comes down to the amount of people that you have heard of that they're on the road and their last resort, that have that breakdown, that have that major issue, what do they do? What is the recourse? Do they just scrap their rig? Do you know, like, again, personalizing, do you have any personal stories, experience with this, and how do they rebound? How do they, like, what is that what is that process? What does that look like?
Well, of course, it's different for every person, right? I mean, but I think that I definitely have many stories of that. Have heard and experienced it myself and seen it many times. Um, the Home on Wheels Alliance, I just to put a word out for them, does a lot of great work. They actually have a it's called like the Nomads Fund, right? Where they have a fund for people who break down on the road to help them to get their vehicles back and running exactly for these situations because it is so common. And that's why their first rule, their first advice is make a savings fund for your breakdown, right? Because it's going to happen. It just is. And going back to the story of the woman that I shared about in San Diego, or the man who was in the RV who got ticketed over and over, the RV is from the 70s, right? That they purchased because they can't afford $150,000, $400,000 new RV, right? They're buying one that's $5,000 or $1,000, right? It's from 1978. So the fact is, it's going to break down if it hasn't already, and it might barely run. So the costs of that vehicle maintenance and the potential of that happening when you're on the road is can be extreme. So, on one hand, a lot of people learn how to do maintenance on the vehicle. That's kind of one of the things you kind of have to. A lot of people don't know how to, and they may be stuck having to give up the vehicle and buying a cheaper vehicle. They might sell the vehicle, as we've seen a lot. One of the things I think that sort of it's interesting, but what sort of defines a nomad is not so much the movement but the potential to change, the ability to respond to these environmental changes very quickly. So what sort of defines a nomad is this environmental reflexivity, this ability to respond to environmental changes. And having a vehicle break down while you're moving around your home, your shelter break down, is common. And being and having to like shift to a new form. I mean, I've known people who, go out on the road, come back a year later, and there's 7 vehicles different, right? By the time they come back, because they break down, you get a new one, you get, and they just sort of like, kind of limp them along until they get home. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question. I think there's so much variety there in how people can respond.
Well, I'll be very specific. Let's say, and I'm gonna do a series of fast scenarios because I'm curious your thoughts. The first one is someone that last resort vehicle, they have $1,000 in their bank account, and that is precious to them to a major degree. Their rig breaks down on the side of the road, and no credit cards, $1,000 cash in a bank account. They have a little money coming in each month, but the repair is $3,000 to get it movable. And that's without tow fee. That's it. Like, what do people do? And like, do they literally just like they take out what they can and then the tow truck takes the rig and they're just on the streets? Is that literally what happens?
Yes, it does. In many cases, people have to get. I mean, if they're lucky, they get out what they can before the tow truck takes it. Because if everything they own is inside that vehicle, where else do they put it? Right? If they lose their vehicle, that's one of the challenges, right? How much can you actually recover from a vehicle that's going to be taken if it's sort of holds all your property? So yes, they do that. Sometimes they'll bring it to a mechanic and find a friendly mechanic who might do the work for on the cheap. Maybe they can bring it to a mechanic and leave it there for a month while they wait for their next payment to come in and live in the vehicle in a parking lot. Sometimes people are friendly about that. If they're out of the cities, they might be able to stay in like a BLM area while they're waiting to sort of that next month of payment to be able to cover costs of repairs. But one of the big challenges, of course, is that even with BLM areas, you really can't do maintenance or repairs yourself. A lot of those maintenance and repairs in public spaces. You're really not allowed to change your oil or drop your transmission or something on a public parking. And you really shouldn't in BLM areas, even though people might. So I mean, yes, that's exactly what people do. Is that they sort of um, make do and try to keep hold of their home, and if not, if they have to, sell it and get a cheaper one, and try to move everything into that.
Okay. So scenario number two, somebody's driving. They have a 2000 school bus. It's painted. It's not yellow. They're parked on the let's say a city street in an industrial area. There's really no signs. There's trucks and everything, but a cop comes up and is asking them if the cop can come in. And I know it depends on city to city, state to state, but is there a blanket cross country law to where, and again, we're just throwing it out there. The school bus is their home. Does the cop have to get a warrant, or is it literally to the point of state by state, principality by principality? It's just going to depend.
Yeah. So the answer is that it generally is state by state, municipality to municipality, but unfortunately, the law errs at the like sort of national level on the side of the police officer being able to go in without a warrant, because the vehicle, whether or not it is a home or not, is because it is mobile. There is an assumption that a person who might be perpetrating a crime could leave a jurisdiction before an investigation is able to be finished. Right. And so for that reason, like if you were pulled over, they thought you had drugs in your car, they can search your car without a warrant because you could just leave their jurisdiction before they get that warrant. That's how it works in any kind of vehicle, unfortunately. And there have been some cases around that ultimately did reinforce that ruling. So there has been pushback, particularly back in the 90s. There were some cases around this. But as it stands now, in most places, they would have the police officer would have a case. You might be able to fight it, right? But they would have a case for being able to go into your vehicle and search it without a warrant, unfortunately. Now there are states like Washington where the Homestead Act in Washington says that I'm sorry, that a primary residence, a home, cannot be sold to pay for an outstanding fine or fee. And there was some recent casework in Seattle, in Washington, what's called the Seattle versus Long decision, where a man had his vehicle, a truck that was impounded with all of his tools in it, and he lost everything. And the Supreme Court found that because his truck was sold to pay for that impounded storage, which is really common, that essentially violated the Homestead Act. So in the state of Washington, if you can actually say that your vehicle is your home, it can be protected against impound and tow, right? Or tow and impound. So it's an interesting, there's some, it does depend on state to state, but for the most part, a vehicle residence is governed as a vehicle under sort of search and seizure laws.
So another archetype here, a young couple living in a camper van, both have a computer job. They're not necessarily killing it, but they're like making a decent living. How much are you actually seeing that versus people that are forced into it? And I know you have a wide spectrum. Is it literally to the point to where you have this one camp, no pun intended, over here, and you have this other camp over here, and there's no middle ground? Is it two separate people in general, or are you seeing a little bit of a mix? Like, how many people are you seeing that are working from the laptop or working seasonal jobs? They're working at the laundromat down the road that's also a kayak rental spot, so they park their vehicle, they're like true digital nomads, versus those forced into it. What are the spectrums? Are they completely separate people? What are you seeing with that?
That's great. Another great question. So this is where I talked before about people living in the cities, and we see that as people who are geographically tethered, people who are connected to a very specific geography, physical space. People I've met, to answer your question specifically, probably about, well, as I've gone more into the rural areas and out of the cities, and that number is increasing about people who I'm meeting who are on the roads. Probably, I mean, at this point, probably about half of the people who I'm working with are outside of the cities. Mainly, and also honestly, it's because I continue to work within homeless, quote unquote, services sectors in the cities, because that's where a lot of my background is. That keeps me connected to people who are in the cities. Otherwise, most of my work nowadays is actually out with people who are at the Home on Wheels Alliance or Schoonapalooza or Descend on Bend or any of these larger sort of gatherings. And most of those people at those events, I shouldn't say most, a good portion of the people at those events are digital nomads. They're exactly the person that you're describing. And I've done interviews with them. I'm writing a book actually right now in which a chapter features a couple that very much matches the description you just gave. They make $150,000 a year. They have good jobs. They are living their American dream. They're have a property ownership. They're saving up for future property ownership, and life is great. And so I think that for that group of people, we might say that they are geographically untethered or geographically semi-tethered, and that there's sort of the difference being that, this is where I would say that there's actually vehicle residents as a whole sort of fall into these three different categories of behavior. I wouldn't say that there's a separation, because there's a lot of back and forth. There's a lot of overlap among these groups, among sort of the use of space. But the category of behavior really has to do with how long a person spends within a particular area. So, like within a 100-mile radius, if a person spends, say, 3 months out of the year within a 100-mile radius, we might consider them to be semi-tethered, right? Because they're using that other 9 months to move around, right? So that might be people who stay during a winter time with family or friends. Maybe they are working in outdoor recreational work or campground services, or, all these sorts of seasonal work that we know about, or working in various harvests, whatever that might be. And then we have people who aren't staying more than 3 months, right? It's less than 3 months that they're staying in more than in a 100-mile area. And they are your true sort of digital nomads, right? But some of them aren't working at all, right? Some are working, some are retired, some are on Social Security. So this is where I think that rather than trying to separate based upon the resources a person has, or their type of job, or their income level. It's better to sort of think about it in terms of where people live, in that sense of like how long they live in a particular area, because that actually is sort of what I was getting at before, is sort of really the differences in the conditions, because the person who's geographically tethered tends to experience this discrimination within the cities, because that tends to be where they're geographically tethered to. And when they get out and they become untethered or semi-tethered, they see that a lot of that discrimination sort of goes away when they're in these open areas with other people living in vehicles who are able to say, hey, I respect your vehicle and I love your home. Right. And so that's where I think that there's actually a tremendous amount of overlap among vehicle residents. I approach vehicle residency from a big tent perspective, right? We have a very big tent of people living in vehicles, and really it's just the differences is where they're living in vehicles and for how long.
Yeah. So we're coming up to an hour now, and I have one overarching question. I think that answer kind of ties into this. As an anthropologist, as somebody that's studying this, what does this tell you about human nature as a whole? Because you have the California property owners that don't give a shit about some, like, that RV is ugly. I want it out of here. I don't care about their situation, which has its own thing. That's part of human nature. Then you have people that played the game their entire life, and a company gets sold to Mexico, and somebody makes 1.2 billion, and then they're out of a job, and then they have to go into their RV. So you have this whole spectrum. You have this big tent of humanity. If we're expanding out of this smaller tent within the big tent of humanity, but you've also seen the good. You see the people putting forth the effort and the alliances and the money and people trying to help. So what has all of this taught you? What is the 30,000 view from all the bullshit to the good, to the heartaches, to people having $150,000 a year living in a van with property and doing the American dream that way? Like you're literally just seeing this whirlpool of humanity.
Yeah.
What has it taught you? Any points that have been taken from that?
Yeah. So I would say that the biggest takeaway from this, from a sort of an anthropological on, in that sense, a humanist perspective, what is it, what does this tell us about humanity? Is that, and this is not new information. This is just sort of something that I think we already know, but we may not think about too much, right? Is that people have been living in vehicles far longer than people have been living in cities. That the concept of nomadism, the idea that people live in this sort of relationship within their environment, of moving around when the environment pushes them to move, is something that has allowed people, um, the empowered people, to live in every place on this planet, on every continent, move into space, into the deepest oceans. Our ability to adapt our homes to our environmental conditions is what allows humans to thrive and succeed. It is what really is what has pushed us to be sort of, this very expansive species that has populated so much of our world and expanding out even beyond. The reality is that while nomadism has been around, uh, for kind of since the dawn of humanity, the concept of the nomad is an invention of cities. That it is city people defining what it means to not live in a city. That the reality is that people have used adaptive housing as a way to work together and respond to their environment successfully, for hundreds of thousands of years. And really, it's only been about the last 10,000 years, plus or minus, that we have been in these walled cities. And then we call the people who live outside those walled cities the nomad. And that's where that discrimination, I think, that's really where it kind of gets rooted in, is this idea that the people who are doing it right are living in that normal version of housing, the sticks and bricks, the four walls, a roof, and a foundation. And it creates this idea that people who are living outside the cities, who are living in vehicles or whatever other form of public spaces, are seen as doing it wrong. And I think that fundamentally, seeing that, realizing that, is what allows us to push back against it, to say, well, that's just not true. Right. I mean, the reality is that people have lived in these ways in vehicles and in adaptive housing in successful ways far longer than we've been living in cities. There's so much we can get from this. And as we see mass displacement occurring in our society, and as we see environmental challenges, climate change, flooding, fires, let alone gentrification, evictions, all of these things that are occurring that we all experience, we're all seeing around us, that the people who are using their vehicles as a response to that environmental displacement are continuing this ancient human tradition of adaptive homemaking. That rather than seeing nomadism, vehicle residency, that rather than the policymakers seeing this as an aberration, as something that's wrong or bad or backwards, the van down by the river, we need to shift to see what I think so many that you know and so many of your listeners know is the value of that vehicle home. That there is a private property value, that there's a stability, that there's all these resources and this ability to move around the world and access new resources. That this is a very empowering form of housing, and that we need to deconstruct that settlement bias that says that this form of housing cannot be empowering, because it is, and it always has been. And it really is about providing the infrastructure and the support so that housing is empowering and not discriminating it so that it's is stigmatized. That's really what I've learned, and I think that that's sort of where it's led my work to go, to really build on, to show and spread the knowledge of people like yourself, of people like of your listeners, of people who attend these gatherings, to the policymakers, to show, look, we're backwards on this. The cities are backwards. The people who are running the cities are backwards. They need to see this in a different way, and we need to create spaces for people living in their vehicles, or else they have no options but to live in public parking. Right, and ultimately, if the city policymaker has a problem with the person in public parking, they need to create a space for that person to park in their city.
I agree. All right, Graham. I appreciate your time. I'm sure we'll have a follow up sooner or later. In the meantime, if any of the listeners, both video and podcast, your links will be down below. But just if you want to mention how people can get a hold of you, if they have any questions, if they want to check out your work, how can they reach out to you?
Yes, yes. Please email me at Graham, Graham, like the graham cracker, at vehicleresidency.org. You can also visit that website, vehicleresidency.org, to learn more about the National Vehicle Residency Collective. You can learn about the summit that we had in November. We have all of our sessions posted on YouTube, and there's a link there. So you can actually watch the summit sessions that we had with people from Home on Wheels Alliance, researchers, policymakers, parking program operators talking about their systems. And also you can sign up to be a part of the National Vehicle Residency Collective, and which again is centers the experiences of people who live in vehicles to drive these conversations. So I hope that you can join our work, and we would love to work with you specifically.
Awesome. Thanks for your time today, bub.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.